encounters occur outside of sleep.
So where does this leave John Mack's research? Where does it go from here? Is it more than sleep paralysis? Is there something happening within the brain?
Interestingly, when they hear an alternative explanation, they are resistant to accepting that. They don't buy it. And so there's a spiritual payoff ultimately from these folks that makes them resistant to accepting an alternative, rather mundane explanation for their experience. And that's the same with John Mack. He was a very spiritual type of guy. I mean, when I asked him once, do you really believe that people can be whisked through walls? And he says to me, well, you know, Rich, you are trapped within a Western scientific framework. If you look at it from an Eastern perspective, there's multiple levels of consciousness, blah, blah, blah. He turned on the fog machine. I had no idea what he was talking about at this point. But he was very resistant to those type of explanations. In fact, when he saw our psychophysiologic data, of course, he was quite excited by this. But he says, aha, here's evidence that something must have happened. Surely the mind, imagination, cannot produce physiological reactions that are greater than that of the Vietnam vets with PTSD. Surely something must have happened. He underestimates the power of imagination, in my opinion.
Rich McNally is only one of many people who are insisting that this is either sleep paralysis or some imagined state. You never mind the dysfunctions completely differently than sleep paralysis, and that sleep paralysis doesn't have all of the same narratives. And sleep paralysis doesn't generate an evolution of consciousness or shift in consciousness that these experiences are generating.
But you've got to understand Richard McNally's point of view, because it is the logical one within the framework of which most people live.
I see that what Rich McNally is doing is natural. That's his need to make sense about what's happening here. These experiences fall outside of our definition of reality, and what happens to the receiver or the listener when they hear that.
You must have taken some solace, though, that at least there was a scientific experiment that showed that there was a very strong physiological response, i.e. you were not imagining something.
Absolutely. It was satisfying to know that here was something measurable. So to get that it was a powerful enough experience that our body would create very, very strong reactions in hearing it was definitely satisfying. So that's the small piece of comfort to take out of it. But the rather large piece of discomfort, that we all sit with is that, these experiences aren't happening anymore. This phenomena has interjected itself into our lives. It's left. If it was sleep paralysis, then I would still be reporting the same things over and over again, and I'm not reporting that, and neither are other experiencers. Most of us would like to know what the hell happened.
John Mack's book, based on his research with more than 100 experiences, was called Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. Published in 1994, it was an instant bestseller and made Mack internationally famous and infamous.
Welcome to another presentation of the Emerging Renaissance and Odyssey of the Spirit with Dr. John Mack from Harvard University, the Department of Psychology.
I was quite high profile in the spring of 1994 when my book first came out, and that was part of the enthusiasm of my publishers. And I began to feel uneasy that maybe I'd better see how this was going down in the dean's office.
Mack went to see the then dean at Harvard Medical School and was informed that a committee had been appointed to investigate his research on alien abductees.
And I knew him well. He was a friend. He said, John, if you had just said this was a new psychiatric syndrome, you wouldn't have gotten into trouble. He says, it's because you said it required that we change our view of reality that a problem has arisen here. The point had to do with the fact that they didn't like what I was saying. And what particularly they tried to silence me around was the notion that by supporting the truth of what these people were experiencing, possibly I was affirming them in a distortion or in a delusion. That's what I had to fight, that I was actually harming my own clients by believing them or by taking them seriously.
John knew instantly that this was going to be a very contested proceeding and that he could, in fact, be the first faculty member in the history of this university to lose his tenure.
Attorney Eric McLeish was appointed by John to defend him. He saw the internal investigation as a case for academic freedom, and also one where Harvard Medical School was distorting John Mack's views by saying he believed in aliens.
It was really outrageous that this man had to go through this inquiry. The idea that John Mack would put his own agenda above the interests of his patients was abhorrent. There was never any proof of it, and the evidence that we mustered was exactly the opposite, that he was simply willing to listen. So our defense was, you're distorting John's views. Who better to talk about the harm that he was doing to his patients than his patients? And so I talked to more than 70 people that John had treated. Most people were more than happy, some anonymously, some with their names. I spoke with a judge in California. The only person that this man had ever told was John Mack. He was too petrified to tell anybody else. John Mack was his lifeline. You know, what this really was about was Harvard saying, look, you know, we don't like this because you can't show any of this through double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And John was really saying, well, you know, there's some real mysteries here. And I don't know what's going on with these people, but I can't dismiss them as mentally ill.
When did they suddenly realise we're not going to win here? Mack does have a right to academic freedom.
Well, it wasn't for a long time. Once we started talking to the media, I had a sense that this was going to resolve. If we were going to have a full-blown trial, we were going to bring in people, and we were going to want the proceeding to be a public one. And we made that clear. I think the judge in California was prepared to fly in. People were willing to sacrifice their anonymity, and I don't think that's what Harvard had in mind at all.
After 14 months of stressful and bitter negotiations, the investigation was over. Free to pursue his research, John Mack started the John Mack Institute. The aim was to explore how different perceptions and beliefs about reality shape the human condition. But after Mack's untimely death in England, he was killed in a car accident while attending a conference on T.E. Lawrence, what will be his legacy? Will he be remembered for his work as a psychologist, as Sally Mack and many of his professional colleagues believe, or, as Dr. J. Lifton wonders, and many of Mack's obituaries suggest, will he always be known as the Harvard professor who believed in aliens?
I don't think there's anything wrong with his being remembered for what he did in relationship to research on aliens, as long as it's thought about seriously in terms of his efforts and what he was after.
He was just an extraordinary therapist and teacher, so I don't think that will ever be forgotten. I would hope that if more is understood and accepted, that John will get some credit for paving the way. What I think he really did, and maybe this will really make a difference for people, is that he listened to people that other people wouldn't listen to.
Abduction, Alienation and Reason was presented by Sue Nelson. It was a peer production for BBC Radio 4 by Angela Hind.